The wolf's eyes glowed like twin moons in the darkness, unblinking, unwavering. Every night it came. Every night it stared. And every night, Thomas felt the weight of its gaze pierce through the frosted window of his cabin, as though the creature could see straight into his soul. But tonight was different. Tonight the wolf didn't linger in the shadows. It stood at the edge of the forest, its fur matted with snow, its breath visible in the freezing air. And then it howled, a sound so mournful, so full of longing, that Thomas's heart clenched in his chest. He knew deep in his bones that this wasn't just another night. Something was coming, something terrible. Thomas had come to the Alaskan wilderness to escape. The grief of losing his wife, Sarah, to a sudden illness had been too much to bear in the city, where every street corner, every coffee shop, every breath of air seemed to remind him of her. He'd sold everything, packed what little he had left, and driven north until the roads ended. His cabin was a solitary outpost in a sea of white, surrounded by endless forests and jagged mountains. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear, where the silence could swallow you whole if you let it. But the silence didn't last. The wolf came on the third night. At first Thomas thought it was just a stray, drawn by the scent of food. He'd tossed it a scrap of meat, hoping it would leave. But it didn't. It ate the offering, then sat back on its haunches and stared at him with those piercing yellow eyes. Night after night it returned, always at the same time, always to the same spot. Thomas began to feel like the wolf wasn't just watching him, it was waiting for something. The weather turned brutal, as it often did in the Alaskan winter. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the cabin. Thomas's supplies were running low. He'd planned to restock in the nearby town, but the storm had made the roads impassable. He was trapped, alone, with only the wolf for company. And then, on the seventh night, the wolf did something it had never done before. It approached the cabin. Thomas heard the soft crunch of its paws in the snow, the low growl in its throat. His heart raced as he grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling. He'd never shot a wolf before, but he wasn't about to let it break into his home. He flung open the door, ready to fire, and froze. The wolf wasn't alone. A child stood beside the wolf, a little girl no older than 6. She was barefoot, her thin nightgown clinging to her shivering body, her dark hair plastered to her face by the snow. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death. She looked up at Thomas with wide, terrified eyes, and in that moment, he saw his daughter who had died with Sarah in the car accident he couldn't stop thinking about. His daughter, whose face haunted his dreams every night. The wolf growled again, low and warning, as if daring Thomas to turn them away. He hesitated, his mind racing. The girl was clearly in trouble, but bringing her inside meant risking his own survival. He barely had enough food and firewood for himself, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. And then there was the wolf. Could he trust it? Or was this some kind of trap? The girl took a step forward, her small hand reaching out to him. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Help me." Thomas's resolve crumbled. He couldn't leave her out there to die. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. The wolf followed, its eyes never leaving Thomas's face. He wanted to shut the door, to keep the beast out, but something stopped him. The wolf had brought the girl to him. It had saved her life. Maybe it wasn't a threat after all. Inside the cabin, Thomas wrapped the girl in blankets and sat her by the fire. She didn't speak, just stared into the flames with those same haunted eyes. The wolf lay down at her feet, its head resting on its paws. Thomas watched them, his mind spinning. Who was this child? Where had she come from, and why had the wolf brought her here? Days passed, and the storm raged on. Thomas shared his meager supplies with the girl, though it meant going hungry himself. He tried to get her to talk, to tell him her name. But she remained silent, her eyes always darting to the wolf as if seeking its approval. The creature never left her side, its presence a constant reminder of the strange bond between them. One night, as Thomas sat by the fire, the girl finally spoke. "He's not a wolf," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my father." Thomas stared at her, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness far beyond her years. "He was cursed, a long time ago. He can only take his human form when the moon is full. But the curse is breaking. That's why he brought me to you. He knew you could help." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a traumatized child, but something in her tone, in the way the wolf watched him, made him believe her. "How?" he asked. "How can I help?" The girl reached into the pocket of her nightgown and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden figurine. It was a wolf, its head thrown back in a howl. "This is the key," she said. "You have to break it, but once you do, the curse will be lifted and he'll be human again. But you have to do it before the next full moon. If you don't—" Her voice trailed off and she looked away. Thomas took the figurine, his hands trembling. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let this child down. He couldn't let her lose her father, not when he'd lost everything himself. The night of the full moon arrived, and with it, the final storm. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow fell so thickly that Thomas could barely see his hand in front of his face. He stood outside the cabin, the figurine clutched in his hand, the wolf and the girl beside him. He raised the figurine high above his head and brought it down on a rock, shattering it into pieces. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air seemed to crackle with energy, and the wolf let out a howl that echoed through the forest. Its body began to change, its fur receding, its limbs elongating. And then, where the wolf had stood, there was a man. He looked at Thomas with gratitude in his eyes, then swept the girl into his arms. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given us our lives back." Thomas watched as the man and the girl disappeared into the storm, their figures fading into the white. He felt a strange sense of peace, as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know if he'd ever see them again, but it didn't matter. He'd done what he needed to do. As he turned back to the cabin, he noticed something lying in the snow. It was the broken figurine, the pieces now glowing faintly. He picked them up, feeling a warmth spread through his fingers. And for the first time in years, he smiled. The storm would pass, the sun would rise, and Thomas knew deep in his heart that he was finally ready to face whatever came next.